The town of Jessup wasn't the kind of place a man stayed unless he had nowhere else to go. Dust hung in the air like old grudges, and the buildings leaned like drunks against the wind. Most folks walked with their heads down and their mouths full of other people's business. And tonight, every eye in the saloon was fixed on her. Yvonne Boone stood beneath the amber glow of a smoky lantern, lips close to the mic on the player piano, dress clinging too tight in the places men stared hardest. She didn't sing for applause. She sang like it hurt, low, rough, and without hope. Her voice didn't lift the room. It reminded it of everything it tried to forget. At a shadowed table near the back, a man sat alone, hat low, coat dusty, a scar trailing down the left side of his jaw like lightning caught in skin. He hadn't touched his drink, just sat still, listening, watching her like he was trying to remember something important. Luke Granger didn't look like the kind of man who spent time in saloons. He didn't fidget, didn't blink too much, didn't speak unless he had to. Most men came in loud and left broke. He came in quiet and hadn't moved since. Yvonne noticed him on her third song, not because he smiled, he didn't, not because he stared, plenty did that, but because he didn't look away when she met his eyes. That stopped her short, just for a second, long enough for a few notes to stumble. The crowd didn't care, but he noticed. When she finished her set, the usual clapping followed, drunken whistles. Grubby fingers tossed coins toward the stage like they were doing her a favor. She stepped down slow, ignoring the men who reached for her. Her eyes flicked once more to the back table, still there, still watching. He tipped his hat as she passed, just a touch of his fingers to the brim. Nothing bold, nothing crude, but it lingered in her chest longer than any hand ever had. As she walked up the narrow stairs to her room above the saloon, she felt it. His gaze on her back, not hungry, not judgmental, just steady, like he was waiting for something. In Jessup, men looked at her like she was a story they already knew the ending to. But this man, this quiet cowboy, he looked like maybe he was reading the first page. The stories about Yvonne Boone spread faster than prairie fire in a dry summer. Some said she came to Jessup after killing a man in Wichita. Others whispered she'd once been the preacher's daughter, until she took up whiskey and sin. Truth was, nobody knew for sure, and nobody cared, not really. In a town like Jessup, once they name you, you stay named. She walked the main street that morning with her shoulders back, eyes forward, dressed clean but a little too red for polite company. A couple wives pulled their children aside. One old man spit near her boots. She didn't flinch, not anymore, not in this town. Inside the dry goods store, she asked for flour and coffee. The shopkeeper's son fetched the bag but wouldn't meet her eyes. She laid her coin down anyway, even as the clerk cleared his throat and gave her that half-pity, half-disgust look she'd grown used to. "You ever think about leavin', Miss Boone?" he asked, voice too casual to be honest. She paused, turned slow. "You ever think about mindin' your own business, Mr. Tally?" He didn't speak again. Yvonne stepped outside into the morning dust. The wind tugged at her shawl, carried with it the faint clanging of a blacksmith's hammer and the gossip of women on a nearby porch. Her fingers tightened around the handles of her sack. She felt them all watching, judging, weighing her worth and finding her wanting. What they didn't know, what they didn't care to know, was that she hadn't chosen the saloon life. It had chosen her, like a snake picks its nest. She'd been 17 when her father sent her away, said she was too much temptation for a man of God. His congregation agreed. She tried respectable. She tried sewing, cooking, scrubbing floors in hotels that smelled of lie and broken dreams, but every job came with a hand on her waist and a whispered offer. The saloon was the first place that paid her to stand in the light instead of hide in the dark. That night she sang again. Luke Granger was back, sitting at the same table, eyes on her the same way they were before, quiet, unblinking, honest. Not hungry, not cruel. For the first time in years she felt something different twist in her gut. It wasn't shame, it was hope, and that scared her worse than all the names they called her. Sheriff Clay Burnett wore his authority like a second skin, tight, polished, and made to impress. His boots clicked loud on the saloon floor as he stepped inside that evening, spurs jangling like a warning bell. The bar quieted just enough to mark his presence. Men tipped their hats, women looked away, and the piano player missed a note. Clay didn't look around. He didn't have to. This town bowed to him out of habit. He found Luke Granger right where he'd expected, still at that back table, still watching Yvonne sing like her soul was stitched into every word. Clay's jaw tensed. His hand rested heavy on the handle of his Colt, not threatening, just reminding. After the song, Luke stood to leave, pushing his glass aside untouched. "You're not from around here," Clay said, voice low and dry like a creek in August. Luke didn't offer a name, just gave a slow nod. "Passing through." "That so?" Clay stepped in close, blocking his path. "Then let me help speed that along." Their eyes met. Luke's was calm. Clay's burned like gunpowder waiting for a match. "You see that girl up there?" Clay asked, jerking his chin toward the stage. "Yvonne Boone?" Luke's gaze flicked to the platform. She was gone now, disappeared upstairs with the weight of too many stairs following her. But he didn't need to look. He nodded once. "She's nothing but trouble," Clay said, too loud now. "Pretty as a painting, poison as a snake. Plenty of men have fallen thinking they could save her. Ain't one of 'em left standing." Luke didn't blink. "She sing real nice." Clay's mouth twitched at the edges, not a smile, a warning. "Don't matter what it sounds like. Hell still comes with a ribbon on it." He stepped closer, his breath reeking of tobacco and threat. "Stay away from her." Luke leaned in just enough to whisper, "Maybe you should have, Sheriff." Silence. The air thickened like a thunderhead, the whole saloon holding its breath. Then Clay stepped back and let Luke pass, but his hand stayed near his holster, and his eyes never left the cowboy's back. Upstairs, behind a cracked door, Yvonne had heard every word. Her fingers gripped the edge of her wash basin as if it might keep her steady. She looked into the mirror, saw the same face she wore every night, painted and perfect, but the memories behind it clawed up like weeds through dry earth. Clay hadn't just left her. He'd broken her. And he was about to break again. Only this time, he wouldn't see it coming. By sundown the next day, the saloon porch sagged beneath the weight of boots, bad intentions, and bourbon breath. Jessup's regulars were already half drunk, spitting tobacco into the dirt and watching the street for a reason to fight or flirt. Yvonne stepped outside in a simple blouse and skirt, nothing scandalous but still enough to turn every head. Luke Granger sat on the edge of the porch rail, one leg draped over the side, eyes following her every move. He hadn't said much since the sheriff's warning the night before, but Yvonne noticed him now more than ever. Like the weight of his gaze settled just between her shoulder blades, steady, certain, unapologetic. She tried to pretend she didn't notice. She failed. Then came the rancher, big, drunk, and bitter. The kind of man who believed the world owed him something, and Yvonne was the interest payment. His name was Merritt Poe, a cattleman from the edge of town with a gut full of liquor and a brain soaked in rot. "Yvonne," he slurred, stumbling toward her. "Been singing real sweet lately. Thought maybe I'd get a private encore." She stepped back, face tightening. "Get back on your horse, Merritt." He grinned like a dog with a broken tooth and reached for her arm. That's when Luke moved. No words, no warning. Just the sudden scrape of his boot against the porch and the thud of his shoulder slamming into Merritt's chest. The drunk hit the ground hard, coughing up dust and cursing as blood trickled from his lip. Silence swept the street like a curtain falling. Merritt scrambled to his feet and reached for the pistol on his hip, but Luke already had his hand on the man's wrist, twisting hard until bone cracked and the gun dropped into the dirt. "Pick it up," Luke growled, voice low as thunder on the edge of a storm, "and I'll finish this." Merritt froze. His breath hitched, fear slipping in where pride used to be. He backed off, eyes flicking to the onlookers, none of them willing to help. Then he staggered off, nursing his wrist and cursing under his breath. Yvonne stood frozen. She hadn't asked for saving. She hated being seen as someone who needed it. But, God help her. The way Luke looked at her, like she mattered, like she wasn't just some punchline, she felt something shift deep in her chest. Behind them, the sheriff watched from across the street, leaning against a post, chewing the end of a matchstick. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes told the whole story. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The stairs creaked like an old confession under Yvonne's bare feet as she climbed to the second floor of the saloon. The scent of cheap perfume and stale whiskey clung to the walls. This hallway had heard more sin than any preacher could ever pray away. But tonight it felt different. Behind her, Luke followed without speaking, his boots slow and steady on the wood. He kept his hat low, but not in shame, in thought. He moved like a man who'd fought ghosts, and maybe hadn't won. At the top, Yvonne paused outside her room. Her hand trembled just slightly as she turned the knob. The lantern inside flickered low. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, cracked washstand, a chipped mirror, but it was hers. She stepped aside and nodded for him to enter. Luke hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded once. "Ain't like that." His eyes held hers a beat too long, then he stepped inside. The door closed with a whisper. The room swallowed them. He stood near the window, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the dark streets below. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly cold, though the room was warm. "I didn't ask for what you did," she said, quiet. "I know," he replied, still watching the window. "But I ain't the kind to stand by when someone gets grabbed like livestock." She looked down at her hands. "Most folks in Jessup think I'm no better than that." Luke turned then, slow and calm, and sat across from her in the only chair the room held. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I don't care what they think. I care what's true." Yvonne laughed, a bitter, tired sound. "Truth don't matter much in a town like this. Reputation does, and mine's been rotted clear through." "You weren't born with that," he said. "Somebody nailed it to you." She looked up, eyes sharp. "Yeah, and someone like Clay Burnett held the hammer." The room tightened with silence. Luke reached into his coat, pulled out a small silver flask, and offered it. She took it with a faint smirk, drank deep, then handed it back. "I sing for drunks and smile at men who smell like cow shit," she said. "But there's more to me than this red dress." Luke nodded. "I figured." She stood then, crossing to the window beside him. The town looked small from up here, sad, like it was shrinking beneath its own weight. She rested her hand on the sill and looked at him. "You got secrets, cowboy?" He met her eyes. "Plenty." They didn't touch, didn't kiss. But the space between them felt like a lit fuse, and in that still moment, in that narrow upstairs room, they were two people who hadn't yet broken each other, but just might heal something if they didn't run. Luke Granger stood alone in the alley behind the saloon, moonlight cutting through the dark like a blade. He rolled a smoke between his fingers but didn't light it, just kept staring at the folded scrap of paper he'd pulled from his boot. The edges were worn soft. The ink had bled over time, but the name scrawled at the bottom was still clear. Clay Burnett. He didn't come to Jessup for Yvonne. He hadn't even known she existed. But now, with her eyes in his mind and her voice stuck to his ribs like dried blood, things were getting tangled. Luke was a tracker. Used to be, anyway, before the mistake. He'd spent 5 years running bounties, living off the edge of the law and whatever whiskey he could afford. It paid well when it went clean. It also put a bullet in his leg and a scar across his jaw, but none of it marked him as deep as the one bounty that went bad. A man named Boone, said to be a horse thief with warrants in 3 states. The poster looked like a dozen others. Luke found him holed up in an old mining shack, drew first, fired fast. Later learned the man wasn't who they claimed. Wrong Boone. He never told the family. He never stuck around to learn who that man had really been to anybody. Until now. Yvonne Boone. He didn't know for sure. The name could be coincidence. Could be 1,000 Boones in the West. But the way her voice cracked when she talked about her past, about betrayal, about Clay. Something in him knew it wasn't coincidence at all. He folded the paper again, slower this time, tucked it back into his boot. That name, Clay Burnett, had led him here. And now it was more than a name. It was a man with a badge, a past with Yvonne, and blood on his hands. Luke turned back toward the saloon. The sounds of the piano drifted out through the walls, bright and hollow. But upstairs, behind the drawn curtain of that little room, was something else, something bruised and breathing and real. He didn't know what he wanted from Jessup anymore. Vengeance? Forgiveness? Maybe both. But one thing was certain, the past had finally caught up with him, and this time it wore a red dress and had a name he couldn't forget. The wind blew hard through Jessup that night, kicking grit across the boardwalks and whistling between buildings like a warning. Inside Yvonne's room, the lantern burned low, casting a warm flicker over faded wallpaper and restless shadows. Luke stood near the window again, arms folded, jaw tense. Outside, lightning flashed in the distance, just enough to paint the town in silver before vanishing into black. The storm was rolling in, and neither of them said a word about it. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was taut, loaded. Yvonne leaned against the wall opposite him, one boot heel pressed against the baseboard. She'd taken her hair down, and it spilled around her shoulders like a curtain hiding every thought she didn't dare speak aloud. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly. "Carrying everything on the inside?" Luke didn't move. "Better than letting the wrong folks hold it." She gave a humorless laugh and looked away. "Well, you rode into the wrong town then." Another flash lit up the sky, and with it thunder cracked close enough to make the glass rattle in its frame. She stepped to the window, brushing his shoulder as she passed. Just a graze, but it felt like fire to both of them. He turned slowly. She was right there, close enough to kiss, close enough to destroy. "You look at me like you don't believe what they say," she said, voice soft but shaking. "Like I'm still worth something." "You are," he said. Simple. Like it was just a fact, not a compliment. Yvonne blinked at him, her mouth parting just slightly. For a moment the storm outside vanished, the town below vanished. Even the ache in her chest seemed to quiet. She leaned in. So did he. Their lips were a breath apart, but she pulled back first. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Don't." Luke's jaw clenched, but he didn't try again. He stepped back like a man surrendering to something bigger than himself. "I ain't scared of touching you, Yvonne," he said, almost to himself. "I'm scared what it'd mean if I did." She nodded, arms wrapped around herself now like armor. "You kiss me, and I'll burn. I know it." Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain hit the roof like hooves on hard dirt. And inside that little upstairs room, Two souls stood inches apart, close enough to fall, too raw to catch each other just yet. The saloon creaked and moaned like an old ship at sea when the wind picked up. Jessup was quiet after the storm, but inside Yvonne's room the silence held teeth. Luke had already left before sunrise. Said nothing, just slipped out like a shadow. That was his way. But Yvonne knew he'd be back. She felt it in her bones. She sat on the floor now, pulling up one of the warped planks beneath the threadbare rug. Her hands moved quick, practiced. She knew which nail to pry, which board gave easiest. This wasn't the first time she'd hidden herself in this room. Beneath the floor, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and years of dust, lay a battered leather journal and a small bundle of letters, bound in twine so tight the paper curled at the edges. She hadn't opened it in a long time. Her fingers hesitated, trembling. Then, slow as Sunday forgiveness, she untied the twine. The pages inside were worn, ink smudged from time and tears. It wasn't the writing of a woman in love. It was the voice of a girl clawing to stay sane. She'd written about the first night Clay had cornered her in the back hall, about the promises he'd whispered, the lies he spun, about how quickly kindness turned to claim. "I'm not a whore, Daddy," one entry read. "I didn't choose this. I didn't ask to be thrown out. Clay wasn't love. He was survival. And I was 17. God help me, I thought he'd save me." Another page trembled in her hand, the one she nearly burned once. It read, "He said if I ever told he'd swear I begged for it, that I'd already been passed around too much to be believed. And when he laughed, Lord, the way he laughed, like he knew the world would side with him." Yvonne's breath hitched, shoulders curling forward as the weight of those memories bore down again. But she didn't cry this time. Instead, she set the journal aside and reached deeper into the hole. Her hand touched something cold, metal. She pulled it out, a small derringer, rusted at the hinge but still deadly. She'd taken it off Clay once when he was too drunk to notice, kept it for insurance. Tonight, it felt like prophecy. There was no more hiding. The truth was here, bound and scrawled in her own hand. And now there was Luke, watching her like a man who could see through the paint and shame. If she was going to bury her past, it wasn't going to be under the floor anymore. It was going to be in him, or in Clay Burnett, whichever took it first. The next morning, the saloon doors creaked open with the lazy groan of old wood and worn hinges. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching the dust in the air like floating ghosts. Most folks barely looked up from their cards or their drinks, but Luke did. The man who stepped inside wasn't a local. That much was clear. His coat was too clean, his boots too polished, and the silver spurs on his heels clinked like they liked being heard. He had a wide grin and cold eyes, the kind of man who smiled as he watched things burn. Luke watched him scan the room, casual-like, until his eyes landed on Yvonne, who had just stepped behind the bar. The stranger tipped his hat with 2 fingers and said one word, "Lila." The whole room paused, quiet as a held breath. Yvonne's face went pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tight her knuckles whitened. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the man like he was a ghost dragging chains behind him. Luke stood slowly. The stranger noticed. "Well now," the man said, voice like honey laced with ground glass. "Didn't expect to find you in a place like this, though I reckon I should have guessed." Yvonne finally spoke, voice low and sharp. "You don't belong here." "That's true," the man said with a shrug. "But then, neither do you." Luke stepped between them without a word. His presence alone was enough to put tension in the room, his stance calm, hand resting close to his hip, not on his gun, but not far either. The stranger smirked. "And who's this? The new bodyguard? Or just another poor fool who don't know what you are?" Luke didn't blink. "You should walk out now." The man chuckled. "Ain't here for a fight, cowboy, just came to collect." Yvonne's voice shook, but not with fear, with fury. "You collect anything from me, I'll see to it they bury you deep." The man lifted his hands and backed up a step, grin still in place. "Ain't no need to get riled. I'll be around. When you're ready to talk, Lila, you know where to find me." He turned, winked at one of the girls near the stairs, and sauntered back out into the daylight like he owned the damn sky. Luke turned to Yvonne. "You know him?" She shook her head once, then nodded. "I wish I didn't." Luke watched the door swing shut behind the stranger and felt something new coil in his gut. This wasn't over, not even close. And whatever truth that man carried, it had Yvonne's real name written all over it. Yvonne hadn't set foot near the old chapel since the day her father cast her out. It sat on the edge of Jessup like a broken tooth in a dying man's mouth, leaning to one side, windows shattered, roof slumped inward like it had given up trying to keep out the sky. Back when she was a girl, it was full of hymns and light. Her father's voice used to echo from the pulpit with fire and brimstone, and folks in town sat up straight when he spoke. Now, only ghosts lingered here, and the bitterness they left behind. She came alone, left the saloon before sunrise, before the drunks stirred and the streets smelled like sweat and regret. Her boots crunched over weeds that cracked through the path like old sins. She stopped at the threshold, fingers twitching at her sides. The door was gone, ripped off its hinges, leaning against the wall like a drunk against a lamppost. Inside, the pews were splintered, dust thick as ash. Rain had slipped through the caved-in roof for years, leaving moldy streaks down the walls where the paint had blistered and peeled. The altar remained, but barely. Yvonne stepped inside. Each board beneath her feet creaked like it still remembered her. She approached the pulpit slowly. The sun slanted through a jagged hole in the roof, casting light like a spotlight on the warped wood. That's when she saw it. A torn page lay across the pulpit, crisp and yellowed. Not fallen from the Bible by accident. It had been placed. Deliberate. Across the margin, carved in slanted knife-scratch letters, was a single word. Whore. Yvonne stared. Her throat locked up, her fists curling until her nails dug into her palms. She picked up the page, eyes scanning the scripture beneath the word. It was from Proverbs. Something about shame and disgrace, about wicked women and crooked paths. Something her father used to quote when she wore dresses with too much color or smiled too long at a boy. Behind her, something shifted, just a whisper of sound. She spun around, but the chapel was empty. Still, she felt it. Someone had been here, recently, and they wanted her to know. Yvonne backed toward the door, heart hammering, breath quick and shallow. She wasn't the same frightened girl who once begged her father not to lock her out. She'd survived too much for that. But this was different. This was hate that remembered, hate that lingered. And whoever left that page knew exactly who she was, and what they wanted her to feel. Shame, fear, control. She slipped the torn scripture into her pocket, but instead of shaking, she smiled. Because whoever left that message didn't know her at all. She'd burned in that chapel once, and if she had to, she'd burn it again. Luke sat alone at the edge of the Jessup cemetery, his back against a leaning headstone, the grass around him stiff and yellow from drought. The town lay quiet behind him, the sounds of hammers and hooves muted by distance and thought. He stared out toward the hills where the wind always ran free. In his lap, the letter unfolded again, its creases now nearly split. He read the name scratched on the bottom like it had answers. Boone. The mistake that chased him like a curse. The wrong Boone. The blood he couldn't scrub from his hands, no matter how long he rode or how far he kept from looking folks in the eye. And now, Yvonne. She hadn't told him the name was hers, hadn't admitted the man he'd killed might have been kin, But her journal, her pain, her silence, it all pointed in one direction, and the math added up ugly. When he finally knocked on her door that evening, she didn't ask why he was there. She just said, "Come in." The room was dark, the lantern low. She stood with her back to him, staring out the window at nothing. "I know who you are," she said. Luke didn't reply. "I know why you came to Jessup. It wasn't for me." He stepped closer. "I didn't know your name until I saw your journal, until I felt it in my gut." "You shot him, didn't you?" she whispered. He nodded once, even though she wasn't looking. "Thought I was doing right. Man fit the poster, matched the scars. Had the stolen horse, too. But it wasn't him. Not the one they wanted." Yvonne turned then, face unreadable. "He was my brother." Luke's heart punched hard in his chest. "I didn't know." "No," she said, stepping toward him. "But you pulled the trigger all the same." She was inches from him now. He could smell her skin, could see the vein beating in her throat. Her hand moved slowly, pulled something from beneath the table, a small revolver. She held it out. Not at him, toward him, handle first. Luke stared at it. "Do what you came here to do," she said. "If this is about guilt, if you want justice, if you need to feel the weight of what you took, take it." His jaw worked as he looked at the gun, and then her. "I came here looking for the man who lied," he said. "But now I realize I found the woman he tried to break." Yvonne blinked, tears threatening but held back by years of being told to shut them off. Luke gently pushed the revolver back toward her. "I won't take another Boone's life. Not ever again." They stood in silence, and in that silence something changed, not forgiveness, not quite, but the first brick laid on the road toward it. And under her breath she whispered, "Then help me bury the past." Luke nodded. "I will, but not with words." Yvonne set the gun down. "Good, because I plan on finishing this with bullets." Yvonne hadn't set foot in the jail since Clay Burnett first dragged her there years ago in the middle of a summer storm, accused of public indecency for dancing too long in the saloon. That wasn't what he cared about, though. He just wanted her locked up where he could remind her who held the key. Now, standing in front of the same iron bars, it all felt sickeningly familiar. Luke stood behind her, his presence like a stone wall. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. His silence meant one thing: he was waiting on her lead, and she was done letting men write her ending. Sheriff Clay Burnett leaned back in his chair, boots crossed on his desk, his badge glinting in the lamplight like a threat. His smile curled slow and cruel. "Well now," he said, "look what the cat drug back in. You two been sniffing around places you shouldn't." Yvonne stepped forward. "We know about Boone, about the bounty, about how you sent Luke after the wrong man." Clay's expression didn't change. "So?" Yvonne blinked. "You knew he wasn't my brother." "I knew he was a Boone," Clay said lazily. "And I knew if he got dead, there'd be one less mouth tellin' stories about what I done." Luke stepped beside her now, his voice iron flat. "You got a lot of folks fooled, Sheriff, but your lies are bleeding through the seams." Clay stood slowly, brushing dust from his vest. "What are you gonna do, cowboy? Drag me through the street like a common criminal? This town runs because of me." "No," Yvonne said, stepping closer. "This town runs despite you." He stared at her, something dark rising behind his eyes. "You think anyone's gonna believe you? A saloon girl with a reputation? You're nothing but the dress you wear and the men who pay to see what's under it." She slapped him, hard. The sound cracked through the jailhouse like a gunshot. Clay's face twisted, not in pain, but in something worse, rage born of bruised pride. He grabbed her wrist fast, yanking her forward. But Luke was faster. In a flash, Luke's hand wrapped around Clay's arm and slammed it down onto the desk. Clay reached for his gun, but Luke knocked it across the room with one swift elbow. "You ever touch her again," Luke growled, "and I'll bury you where they won't bother marking the grave." Clay stared up, breathing hard, caught not by force, but by the look in Luke's eyes, the quiet promise of violence. Luke let go. Yvonne leaned in close, her voice a whisper meant only for Clay. "You branded me once with your name, your lies, your filth, but I ain't wearing it anymore." She turned to leave. Clay called after her, voice laced with venom. "You're still what you've always been, Yvonne. The town'll never forget." She paused, hand on the door. Then, without looking back, she said, "Then maybe it's time the town gets something new to talk about." And with that, she walked out, not as the saloon girl, but as the storm rolling in. The trail out past Devil's Spine was dry and cruel, carved into the hills like an old scar. Wind howled through the rocks, dragging whispers from the canyon below. It was a place where the earth didn't care what you buried, only that you left. Luke led the way, reins in one hand, the other resting near his holster. Yvonne rode behind him, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her borrowed hat. She hadn't said much since they left Jessup. There was too much tangled in her chest to speak plainly: grief, fury, guilt, and something sharper. They came to a small stand of dead cottonwoods near a ravine. Luke dismounted, boots crunching against sun-baked earth. He motioned toward the ground. "Here," he said. Yvonne climbed down slowly. The spot was unmarked, save for a cluster of stones piled uneven, like someone half-heartedly honored the dead. She stood over it, staring down at what remained of a memory. "This where you buried him?" she asked, voice tight. Luke nodded. "I wrapped the body, dug the hole myself. Didn't say a prayer, but I didn't leave him like a dog." Yvonne's eyes glistened, not tears, just the sting of truth. Luke knelt and brushed dust off the stones. "Back then I thought I'd done justice. The poster said Boone. He had the stolen horse, fit the scars, looked mean enough to wear guilt easy." He looked up at her. "But that man wasn't your brother." Yvonne crouched beside him. "Then who was he?" Luke reached into his coat and pulled a folded paper from his inside pocket. It was the original bounty, worn, sun-bleached, and cracked at the creases. He laid it across the top stone like an offering. Name was Jess Boone. Turns out he'd been using a stolen identity. Real name was Thomas Kirkland. He was wanted all right, just not for what I thought. Yvonne stared down at the paper. So Clay knew. "He sent me out to kill a man with a Boone name. He knew it wasn't your brother. Didn't care. All he needed was to make sure the trail went cold, that you were alone." Yvonne stood slowly, arms crossed tight across her chest. "He didn't just brand me. He erased everything I had left." Luke rose too. "Not everything." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time the pain didn't drown the fire in her. "Then help me give him back his name," she said. Luke nodded. "We'll dig him up." Yvonne blinked. "What?" "We'll bring him back. Give him a grave in Jessup. A real one. With his name." Her lips parted, unsure. "You think they'll let us?" Luke shrugged. "I don't give a damn if they do. Some men deserve a stone, and you deserve the truth." They stood in silence as the wind kicked up around them, lifting dust and memory into the air. And just like that, they began to unbury the past, stone by stone, name by name. The air in Jessup had changed. You could taste it. The usual jeers outside the saloon were quieter now, cut short when Yvonne walked by. Men who used to whisper behind their glasses kept their eyes on their cards instead. She wasn't just the show anymore. She was the shift in the wind. Yvonne had shed the painted face and tight corsets. Today she wore a plain dark skirt, her sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a braid that showed the sharp edge of her jawline. She moved through the town with something harder than pride, purpose. She stepped into the dressmaker's shop with a bundle of coin and no small amount of suspicion. "I need black cloth," she said to the startled seamstress. "Enough to sew 6 sashes, wide, ties at the arm." "For mourning?" the woman asked. "For truth," Yvonne replied, dropping silver on the counter. "It's time folks start seeing who we really are." That night, under a quiet sky, she gathered them, 6 women from the saloon and the outskirts. Each of them had Clay Burnett's fingerprints somewhere in their past. Not all carried scars on their skin, but every one of them bled from somewhere deep. They met in the upstairs room of the saloon. Whiskey sat untouched on the table. The mood was somber, electric. Yvonne laid the black sashes down in a row and spoke without trembling. "We've all lost something to that man," she said, "and the town let him. They called us liars, called us whores, said we deserved it." She paused, looked each woman in the eye. "Well, I'm done being what they called me." One by one the women tied the sashes to their upper arms, not as protest, as armor. Yvonne walked to her dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside was the small derringer she'd hidden all those years ago. She checked the chamber, clicked it shut, and tucked it into the back of her waistband. "I ain't looking for blood," she said, her voice low and sure. "But if it comes to it, I won't flinch." The room nodded as one. They didn't march through the streets that night. That would come later. Tonight was for choosing to be seen, choosing to stand, choosing not to be ashamed of surviving. And as Yvonne walked back out into the night air, the revolver at her back and fire in her step, the town didn't know it yet, but a war had just been declared, and the girl they'd once branded a saloon whore, she was leading it. The saloon had never been this full without a fight already breaking out. Folks packed in tight, ranch hands, shopkeepers, gamblers, and even the banker's wife, who usually clutched her Bible like a shield against women like Yvonne. But now she sat near the front, lips tight, eyes hard, waiting. The piano sat quiet. No music tonight, just tension humming in the walls. Luke stood to the side of the bar, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't nervous. He was watching for movement, for danger. He'd seen enough towns go sideways to know what pressure looked like before it cracked. Then Yvonne stepped up onto the small stage. She wore the black again, not the red dress of a saloon girl, but the simple dark blouse and skirt of a woman in mourning, or maybe rebellion. The sash tied around her arm stood out like a scar. The room went dead quiet. "I know most of you think you know me," she said, voice clear as a bell. "You've seen me dance, you've heard me sing, and you've all got your versions of what I've done and who I've been." She let that sit, watching the discomfort ripple. "But what you haven't seen is what he did." She pointed, not vaguely, not softly, but straight at the man near the back. Sheriff Clay Burnett. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, hat low, smirking like it was all a performance beneath him. "You've heard rumors," she said, "but I'm here to give you the truth. Clay Burnett lied about the death of a man he claimed was my brother. He sent Luke Granger here to kill a man who wasn't the right one. He buried the truth to bury me." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Some stood, some sat stiffer. Yvonne raised her voice. "I was 17 when Clay first laid hands on me. He was supposed to protect. Instead, he destroyed. And I'm not the only one." She turned. From the crowd, 6 women stood. Quiet at first. Then one by one they stepped forward, black sashes tight on their arms. Some trembled. Others looked carved from stone. Then Yvonne's voice turned fierce. "This ends tonight." Clay pushed off the wall and started forward. "You're lying," he said, voice sharp. "You got no proof, no law to back you. You're just a saloon girl with a bruised ego." Luke moved then, stepped onto the stage beside her. "She's got me," he said. And I ain't the only one. From the back, a familiar figure emerged. The town judge. He'd heard enough. The tension snapped. Clay drew first. Quick, but Luke was quicker. The gunshot rang like thunder through the saloon, silencing everything. Clay fell backward, crashing into a table, blood blooming across his chest like a red flower no one wanted to see. Smoke drifted from Luke's barrel. Yvonne didn't cry. She just looked at the town and said, "Now, let's rebuild this place with truth." And for the first time in Jessup's memory, no one looked away. The shot still echoed when Yvonne felt the searing punch just below her ribs. She didn't fall, at least not right away. Her body stayed upright through sheer will, as if defiance alone could hold her spine together. Then her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor of the saloon stage like a marionette with strings cut. Luke was at her side before her head hit the wood. Blood bloomed beneath her blouse, warm and soaking fast. The crowd froze, then panicked. Chairs scraped. A woman screamed. Someone shouted for a doctor. But Luke didn't hear any of it. His hands pressed against her wound, trying to slow the flow. His voice cracked through clenched teeth. "Stay with me, Yvonne. You hear me?" Her eyes fluttered. "You shot him?" Luke nodded, fighting panic. "He's gone." "Good," she whispered. "Didn't want to die with him still breathing." The color was draining from her face. Luke tore his bandana and pressed it harder against the wound. Blood soaked through in seconds. The town's doctor elbowed his way through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside them, unrolling a kit with trembling fingers. "She needs light," he said, "and a quiet room. I gotta get this bullet out." Luke scooped her up without waiting. "Upstairs." He carried her past the crowd, up the steps she'd climbed alone 100 times. But this time, every boot step felt like a prayer. Inside her room, the doctor set to work. Luke held her hand, eyes never leaving her face, jaw clenched hard enough to crack bone. "Talk to me," he said. She winced as the doctor probed. "About what?" "Anything." She smiled faintly. "You got kind eyes for a killer." Luke didn't flinch. "You got the soul of a saint for a girl raised in hell." She squeezed his hand. The doctor worked fast, muttering under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. After a brutal few minutes, he held up the flattened slug. "Got it." Luke didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until then. "She's not out of the woods," the doc warned, "but she's tough, tougher than most." Luke nodded, brushing a blood-matted strand of hair from her cheek. Outside, the saloon still buzzed with noise and questions. Some folks whispered she brought it on herself. Others said they'd seen something change in her eyes that night, a fire too bright to ignore. But in that small upstairs room, the only truth that mattered was this: Yvonne Boone, branded, broken, and bleeding, was still alive. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing the world alone. The funeral was quiet. No preacher, no words spoken aloud, just a hole in the hard ground behind the jailhouse and a pine box shoved into it like a secret no one wanted to carry. They buried Clay Burnett the same way he lived, under shadow and suspicion. A few townsfolk came out of obligation. Fewer stayed. No tears were shed. The sheriff's badge had been removed from his chest before the lid closed, left behind on a nail in the office wall. Luke picked it up that night, held it under the lantern light. The tin star was scuffed and bent at the edges, dulled by years of abuse. It had once meant something: law, order, protection. But here in Jessup, it had become a brand of fear. He stepped out behind the jail, where the dust drifted slow across the weeds. In his left hand was the badge, in his right a glass bottle filled with kerosene. He poured it into a shallow tin pan, struck a match, and dropped it in. The fire flared up fast, orange and angry. Luke stared at the flame for a long moment. Then he held the badge out and let it fall. The tin sizzled, blackened, curled at the edges like paper under a magnifying glass. Behind him, Yvonne stood in the doorway. Her steps were slow, still recovering, but her gaze was steady. She said nothing as she watched him burn the last piece of clay burnet. "You know they offered me the job," Luke said, not looking back. Yvonne raised an eyebrow. "Sheriff?" He nodded once. "Said I already did the work. Figured I might as well wear the star." She stepped closer. "And?" "I didn't ride into this town to become its law. I came to bury ghosts." He turned to face her, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "I reckon I did." Yvonne looked at the flame, then back at him. "Ghosts don't bury easy." "No," he said, "but some deserve to burn." They stood there a while longer, side by side, two survivors, two stories twisted into one firelight. In the ashes, the metal badge curled in on itself, unrecognizable now, just scrap in the dirt. Luke kicked dust over the fire. The flame hissed, sputtered, and died. And with it, the last remnants of the man who had kept Jessup in chains. From that night forward, no one wore a badge in that town for a long, long while. But folks stood a little straighter, looked each other in the eye, and when they spoke Yvonne's name, it wasn't with pity anymore. It was with respect. Yvonne stood barefoot in front of the cracked mirror above her wash basin. The morning sun slid in through the crooked shutters, brushing her face in streaks of gold and dust. Her hair hung loose, the braid undone, curling slightly at the tips from the night's sweat. The bandage at her waist peeked out from under her blouse. The wound still ached, still slowed her down, but the pain was clean now. It was healing, not infected, not ignored. She studied herself in the mirror, the line of her collarbone, the smudge of a scar just under her chin from when she fell off a wagon at 10, the faint puffiness still clinging beneath her eyes, a face the town once used as shorthand for sin. For the first time in years, she looked at that reflection not with disgust, but with clarity. She'd survived a man like Clay Burnett, survived betrayal, blood, exile, and here she was, alive, breathing, changed. Luke sat in the chair by the window behind her, boots off, hat resting on one knee. He didn't speak, just watched her. "You ever wonder who you'd be if the world hadn't gotten its claws in first?" she asked quietly. Luke shifted. "All the time." She met her own eyes again. "I used to think I was born wrong, like I came out already cracked." "You weren't," he said. She turned toward him. "I'm thinking of staying." Luke's expression didn't change, but something in his posture eased. "In Jessup?" "I know," she said, half smiling. "It ain't exactly a paradise, but the saloon girls need someone who's walked through fire, someone who don't flinch." Luke nodded slowly. "You're not leaving, but you're not stuck either." "No," she said, crossing the room and kneeling beside him. "I think I'm finally rooted." She took his hand in both of hers. Calloused and strong, his fingers closed around hers like a promise that didn't need words. He glanced at her side. "You still hurtin'?" She shrugged. "Less than I was." He studied her a moment longer. "You sure this is what you want?" "I'm sure of this," she said, lifting his hand to her chest, placing it just above her heartbeat. "This is the first thing I've been sure of in a long damn time." Luke leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. The room was quiet, but full. Outside, Jessup stirred. Wagons creaked past, and boots stomped the boardwalk. Life went on. But something had shifted. The town had started to change, not because someone rode in and fixed it, but because the girl they tried to break looked in the mirror and decided she was worth saving. The saloon looked different in the daylight. No haze of cigar smoke, no cheap piano playing to drown out the regrets, just beams of sun pouring through dirty windows and the soft sweep of a broom brushing against the warped floorboards. Yvonne stood behind the bar, not to pour whiskey, but to count inventory. Ink smudged her fingertips as she tallied bottles and barrels. She was dressed in dark cotton, hair pinned up, eyes clear. There was still pain behind them, but it had shape now, edges she could work around. She'd made up her mind. Luke came in through the front door, sunlight chasing him like a shadow. He wore his usual dusty shirt, coat slung over one shoulder, hat low. But there was something packed tight in his stance, a decision trying to hold still. "You leavin'?" Yvonne asked before he could say a word. He paused, then nodded. "Trail's callin'. There's a ranch outside Bisbee needs hands." Yvonne set the ledger down. "It always calls." Luke stepped closer. "I figured you'd come with." She smiled, soft and sad. "I thought I would too." He waited. "I can't," she said finally. "Not yet." Luke looked down, jaw tightening. "You sure?" "I ain't ever been more." She walked around the bar, stopping in front of him. "There's girls still stuck here. Girls who think they don't have a name past what men give 'em. I won't run from that. I won't leave them to it." Luke stared at her like he was trying to memorize every part, the curve of her mouth, the fire in her voice, the way her hands didn't shake anymore. "Thought maybe we'd find peace out there," he said. "We will," she replied. "But peace don't always ride in a straight line." He smiled, barely. "You're stronger than you know." "No," she said, brushing her fingers against his chest. "I just stopped letting them tell me who I am." Outside, the wind picked up. Jessup's streets were quiet, but watching. Word had gotten around. The saloon wasn't what it used to be. The woman who ran it sure as hell wasn't. Luke tipped his hat low. "You ever want to come find me?" Yvonne nodded. "You'll know when I do." He turned and stepped out into the sun. And Yvonne Boone, once the town's shame, now its heartbeat, turned back to the bar. She had work to do, because staying didn't mean she was stuck. It meant she was building something, and she was doing it on her own damn terms. Snow came late to Jessup, as if unsure it was worth the trouble. It blanketed the roofs in a patchwork of white, softened the sound of boots on boardwalks, and gave the saloon's smoke-stained windows a strange sort of grace. Inside, the hearth crackled, warm, alive. Yvonne sat at the writing desk in her upstairs room, candle flickering low beside her. A stack of folded paper lay to her left, each page worn soft from fingers and time. Her pen scratched slowly across a fresh sheet, ink skipping slightly from the cold. "Luke, I don't know if I'll ever send this. I never do. But tonight your name won't leave my chest." She paused, tapped the end of the pen against her lower lip. The wind howled outside, but in here it was still. She dipped the nib and continued. "You were right to go. I think part of me needed you to. I had to see what I was when no one was standing behind me. Turns out I'm stronger than I ever knew. Turns out you saw that before I did." Below her feet, laughter rose from the saloon floor, softer now, gentler. The girls who still worked the floor weren't alone anymore. Yvonne had hired a cook, a piano player who didn't drink himself blind, and a woman from Bisbee who could patch wounds and souls with equal care. She glanced at the stack of unsent letters, dozens of them, each one a page from her heart that had nowhere to land. "I wish you could see Jessup now. The saloon don't stink like it used to." I opened the windows one morning and left 'em open all day. Some folks walked in and just stood there like they didn't recognize the place. Maybe they didn't. Maybe I don't recognize myself either, not always, but I think that's a good thing. She folded the letter, tucked it into the stack, and bound the bundle with the same black sash she once tied around her arm. The badge Luke burned was buried behind the saloon. The past didn't haunt this place anymore. It just rested nearby, like something tamed but never forgotten. She stood and stretched, bones stiff from the cold. The stars blinked through the window. Somewhere out there, Luke Granger was riding under the same sky, maybe thinking of her. Maybe not. It didn't matter. Because every word she wrote was real. Every memory pressed into paper was hers. and sometimes just writing the truth down was enough to set it free. So she'd keep writing, keep living, keep fighting. Not for the town, not even for him, but for the woman she'd become when no one was looking, the woman who stayed, the woman who rose. The saloon had never looked so clean. White bunting hung across the rafters, borrowed lace framed the windows, and the old piano had been tuned to something close to proper. A wedding was happening in Jessup, right in the same place folks used to drink away their sins and bet their last coins on doomed hands. Yvonne watched from the back corner, hands folded neatly in front of her. The bride was one of her girls, Carla, now standing beside a ranch hand who looked nervous as a colt in the rain. Folks filled the room, laughter flowed easy, no one even seemed to notice the cracked floorboards or the whiskey stains beneath the polish. Jessup was changing. The preacher's words drifted through the room, calm and warm. Yvonne allowed herself to lean against the doorframe and smile. Then the saloon doors creaked open, and a man stepped inside who didn't belong. Tall, dusty, face like old bark and teeth too white for someone that sunburnt. His hat was pulled low, his duster heavy with road grime. But the eyes beneath the brim, they weren't looking for drinks or congratulations. They were looking for blood. Luke's name snapped from the stranger's lips like a whip. "Where is he?" The piano stopped, chairs shifted, faces turned. Yvonne stepped forward instantly. "He ain't here." The man ignored her, reaching into his coat, too fast, too sure. Yvonne screamed, "Gun!" A revolver cleared leather, but the ranch hand, barely more than a boy, was quicker. His hunting rifle cracked before the outlaw could squeeze off a shot. The blast echoed like thunder. Wood splintered. The intruder dropped where he stood. Blood pooled across the floor. Red, shiny, too real. The bride screamed. Yvonne ran to her, arms out, steady voice, calming the chaos even while her own heart galloped. The room scattered in panic, but no more shots came. The danger was over in seconds. She stood over the body, breathing hard. A wedding dress speckled with blood, a town still learning how to breathe again. Luke didn't return that day, but Yvonne knew he would have stepped into the bullet if he'd been there. The past was always looking for cracks to crawl through, and even with Clay gone, Luke still had enemies who wanted him buried. Later she sat at her desk upstairs, blood on her hem, tears she refused to let fall. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Luke, they came for you today. I stood in your place. This town used to take from me. Now I give back. But today it nearly cost me everything again. When you come back, you won't just be riding into my arms." She paused, bit her lip. "You'll be riding into a war I've already started winning." And with that, she signed her name and folded the letter, knowing it'd never be mailed, but needing to write it all the same. The sound of hooves on packed earth echoed low and steady, like a drumbeat rolling into town. It wasn't the kind of entrance Jessup noticed anymore. Too many comings and goings, too many wanderers passing through. But Yvonne heard it from her room above the saloon. She was setting fresh linens, smoothing corners, when something inside her paused. The rhythm of that ride, it wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate. She stepped to the window, hands still, breath caught halfway in her chest. And there he was, Luke Granger. Same hat, same horse, same quiet gravity he always carried like a second skin. Only now he had dust on his coat that didn't come from Jessup, and the way he sat his saddle looked heavier somehow, like the road behind him had tried to eat pieces of his soul. Yvonne moved before she realized it. Down the stairs, across the floor, out into the street. Luke saw her the second he rounded the stable post. Reined in. Dismounted slow. Neither of them smiled. They didn't need to. They just stood there in the cooling light of dusk, that soft golden haze settling over the street, making the world feel smaller and sharper all at once. "You picked a hell of a time to come back," she said. "I heard about the wedding," he replied. Thought maybe it was yours. Yvonne scoffed. With who? This town barely knows how to say my name without choking on it. Luke's jaw twitched. Then they still don't deserve you. Silence settled between them like a blanket stretched thin. Not cold, just worn. She took a slow step closer. Why now? He looked past her, toward the saloon. Because I couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the red dress who didn't flinch when the world tried to kill her. And I had to know if she still lived here, or if she became something even tougher. Yvonne blinked, her throat suddenly thick. She gestured toward the door. You hungry? He nodded once. Starved. She led him inside without ceremony. Just like that, Luke was back in Jessup, back in her orbit. And as the saloon doors swung shut behind them, the few onlookers who'd noticed the exchange didn't know what to make of it. But Yvonne did, because some men leave like a storm, and some return like dusk, quiet, slow, and full of heat that don't need light to burn. The moon hung low and wide over Jessup, casting the town in silver light and long shadows. Most windows had gone dark, boots had been kicked off, whiskey bottles lay empty by the bedposts, but above the saloon, a single lamp glowed behind Yvonne's curtain. Luke sat on the edge of her bed, shirt off, the firelight flickering across the scar on his side, the one that looked like it came from something personal, not just a fight. His coat was folded over the chair. Hat hung on the bedpost. He looked like he wasn't sure if he was staying or just resting before another ride. Yvonne stood at the dresser, brushing her hair out slow. The only sound in the room was the soft scrape of bristles and the occasional creak of the floor beneath Luke's boots as he shifted, unsure. Finally, she set the brush down. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Was afraid," he said eventually, "that I'd come back and find you fixed without me." Yvonne turned, arms crossed but not in anger. "I didn't need fixin'. I needed time to remember I ain't broken." Luke looked up at her, really looked. She moved toward him, one slow step after another, until she stood between his knees, hands resting on his shoulders. "I thought about you," she said. "Every damn night." He rested his forehead against her belly, breathing deep, as if just her scent was enough to clear dust from his lungs. "I didn't want to be another weight on you." She ran her fingers through his hair, gentle as summer wind. "You ain't a weight. You're a home I never got to finish building." Luke pulled her closer, his hands on her hips, fingertips digging in like he was trying to memorize the shape of her. She leaned down, pressed her lips to his forehead, and whispered, "You stayin'?" He looked up, eyes glassy, jaw tight. "If you'll have me." She nodded, just once. Then they kissed. Not like the kind that starts something hot and ends too quick, but the kind that had been waiting years to happen. Slow, full of ghosts and forgiveness. A kiss that didn't promise perfection, just honesty. They didn't talk much after that. He laid her down like she was something sacred. She pulled him in like she'd been waiting forever to feel full again. There was no rush, no heat they hadn't earned. It wasn't about the hunger, it was about the ache. And when dawn crept up over Jessup, the light spilling gold across the floorboards, they were still tangled in each other, finally home, finally still, finally whole. The porch creaked as the little girl ran across it barefoot, her dark curls bouncing, laughter trailing behind like ribbons in the breeze. She leapt off the step and into the arms of a gray-furred dog nearly as big as she was. Dust puffed up around them, golden in the morning sun. Yvonne stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee in hand, her robe pulled snug, hair falling loose down her back. She watched the girl tumble and giggle in the dirt, one boot missing, cheeks smudged with flour from sneaking into the kitchen too early. Behind her, Luke stepped up, pressing a kiss to her temple as he passed. He carried a saddle over one shoulder, the leather worn but cared for, like everything in this house. The saloon still stood, but Yvonne had sold it the year before, turned it into something new, a boarding house for women with nowhere to go. The laughter that came through its walls now was honest. A boy walked past on the road, maybe 12, leading a stubborn mule. He slowed when he saw the little girl, then looked up toward the porch. "That her?" he called to the older man beside him. "That saloon girl?" The man squinted toward the house. "That's what they used to call her." "Then what is she now?" The man looked again, at the girl laughing, at Luke Granger coiling a rope in the yard, at Yvonne in the doorway sipping coffee like peace itself, and said, "She's the reason this town's still standing, son." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the truth in it. Yvonne watched them pass, heart soft. The old words didn't sting anymore. Saloon girl, shame, whore. They belonged to people who no longer mattered. Their voices had faded, drowned out by something real. She turned back inside, placing the cup down as the dog barked and the girl shrieked with joy. Luke stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's got your fire, you know." Yvonne smiled. "God help her." Outside, the town bustled. New families, fewer whispers. A church bell rang without judgment. And somewhere in the distance, a traveler passed through Jessup and heard a story about a woman who once brought down a sheriff, saved a town, and stood taller than the names they tried to give her. What they called her didn't matter, because now, when people spoke her name, they did it with reverence, with respect, with love. Her name was Yvonne Boone, and she'd built a life worth remembering. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the grit, the love, and the fire, don't write off just yet. Hit that like button and subscribe to SaddleHorn Stories for more tales where honor and heart still matter. We've got more waiting on the trail.